Hello, I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. I want to think a little bit today about Charles Darwin and his famous, and maybe we can even say infamous, theory of natural selection. In 1845, Charles Darwin wrote this: "I thank God I shall never again visit a slave country. To this day, if I hear a distant scream, it recalls with painful vividness my feelings when passing a house near Pernambuco. I heard the most pitiable moans and could not but suspect that some poor slave was being tortured, yet knew that I was powerless as a child even to remonstrate. I suspected that these moans were from a tortured slave, for I was told that this was the case in another instance. Near Rio de Janeiro, I lived opposite an old lady who kept screws to crush the fingers of her female slaves. I have stayed in the house where a young household mulatto, daily and hourly, was reviled, beaten, and persecuted enough to break the spirit of the lowest animal. I have seen a little boy, 6 or 7 years old, struck thrice with a horsewhip before I could interfere on his naked head, for having handed me a glass of water not quite clean. I saw that his father tremble at the mere glance from his master's eye. These latter cruelties were witnessed by me in a Spanish colony in which has always been said that slaves are better treated than by the Portuguese, English, or other European nations." That doesn't sound like the Charles Darwin we often hear now, does it? Here is the conclusion to Darwin's Origin of Species. "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into the forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Now that sounds a little bit more like the Charles Darwin we know. One more reading before I start thinking about these things, and this is from 1837, when Charles Darwin was keeping his notebooks on the HMS Beagle. He says this: "If we choose to let conjecture run wild, then animals, our fellow brethren in pain, disease, death, suffering, and famine, our slaves in the most laborious works, our companions in our amusements, they may partake our origin in one common ancestor. We may be all netted together." We may be all netted together. You know, it's curious that Charles Darwin has caused, let's say, a lot of argument over the years, especially among people who are prone toward science and those who are prone toward a more religious view of life. We even have a creation museum, after all, in the United States. So there's been a lot of consternation and argument. What that theory, the theory of natural selection, implies is still very contested ground. The history of my congregation, First Unitarian Society, is that its ministers, however, have always tried to carry the ideas of Darwin as far as we could and stick with the science of it. And that's one of the reasons that First Unitarian Society is a humanist congregation. That the theory of natural selection still causes consternation a whole century and a half after Darwin first published his book, Origin of Species, does not speak well for the educational system in the United States or our political system, and certainly not for the discussions of political, open discussion of religion in the United States, which usually becomes merely an argument. And today I would like to consider one of the persistent criticisms of Darwin's theory, that Darwin could not explain the rise of human morality. Keep this little quote in mind from Darwin, and another little reading from 1871. He says, quote, "The highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. The highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts," end quote. Here is my contention. The theory of natural selection, far from being a stark and cold scientific theory, was and continues to be, as a matter of fact, an impassioned cry for equality and justice and higher moral thinking. A cry for morality and justice far more grounded and stirring than anything available in the religions that human beings follow so tenaciously and still, even today, claim to be the only source of human morality. How can I say that? Well, think again about those three readings. First, I'll give you a little bit of family history for Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's grandfather was a Unitarian, and whose name was Josiah Wedgwood of Wedgwood, China fame. That's where he made his money, and he used a great deal of his riches from his China sales to bankroll Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson, who was the foremost abolitionist in Great Britain in that time period. And we have to remember that Clarkson was actually very, very successful at what he was doing, because the British Empire outlawed slavery in its own dominions in 1807 and its colonies in 1833. So Charles Darwin's family was very much involved in the abolition of slavery movement from the very beginning. Also, a bit of historical trivia. It is that one of the chemists who was working in the Wedgwood China factory was a fellow by the name of Joseph Priestley. You may remember that he is the person who discovered oxygen, and he was also a Unitarian minister from England, but he was driven out by a little more religious folk, and came to the United States and became a good friend of Benjamin Franklin in the colonies. Charles Darwin's father hoped to tone down this radical past a little bit. He wanted to fit in a little bit better with British higher class society, and so he had his son Charles baptized into the Church of England, not as a Unitarian, but as a member of the Church of England. But it's an interesting fact that the father of the theory of natural selection actually married his cousin. And his cousin's name was Emma Wedgwood. Emma Wedgwood, and she was a Unitarian and also considerably more of a liberal thinker than Charles was, at least in public, because he was very careful. But we also have to remember that when Charles Darwin got on the HMS Beagle, the ship that eventually got to the Galapagos, when he got on that ship when he was aged 22, he was a conventional Christian thinker, and he was strongly considering going into the Church of England priesthood seminary when he got back. Well, what changed? In the two readings that I just went over, the facts of Darwin's early life reflect something that we usually don't think of about Darwin, and that is this attitude about slavery. A couple of years ago, there was a book that came out called Darwin's Sacred Cause, How a Hatred of Slavery Shaped Darwin's Views on Human Evolution. And this book, Darwin's Sacred Cause, really focused for the first time this attention on Darwin's beliefs about slavery. And when we look at Darwin's life from this kind of switched around perspective, it looks almost inevitable that he should call religion's bluff concerning its monopoly on morality and show a way toward what he saw as higher morality. Now, a lot of free thinkers get asked this question. Hey, if you're an atheist or an agnostic or a humanist or a free thinker, why don't you just go around murdering whoever you want and stealing whatever you want, because what is there to be afraid of, after all? You're not going into an afterlife. You're not afraid of hell. You're not afraid of punishment from some God from beyond. Why not just do whatever you want? Now, when we are faced with this question, we are sometimes tempted to point out that the stats that point to the higher the concentration of religious people in a population, higher percentage of religious people in a population, the higher the crime and poverty rates are. Now, you don't think of that usually, but that is statistically true. But of course, we freethinkers also are very careful because we know that correlation is not causation, and so we just bite our lip and usually don't talk about those things, and that's why you don't find any freethinkers on Fox News as commentators. Darwin knew that his appeal to religion as a basis for moral behavior would be one of the first objections to the theory of natural selection. And I think that he would have pursued his theory of natural selection even if he hadn't thought that it had any moral basis to it, probably because he was a scientist. But I also suspect that Darwin knew the implications of natural selection would point eventually to a higher morality, as he called it. Now, consider how Darwin framed his discussion. His first book, published in 1859, The Origin of Species, was actually written in 1837. He was very careful about not letting out his theory of evolution because he was very afraid. Again, his cousin and wife, Emma, said, "Charles, publish the book." He said, "No, I'm afraid to do that." But be that as it may, the first book proposed that living things are all one. They are all netted together. Nowadays we use the term web of life, but that wasn't around in the day, and he said netted together. And Darwin, in his first book, avoided the question of the crown of creation, what people were called in those days, as best he could, and tried to avoid pulling the human evolution into that mix. Then, that was 1859. Then in 1871, he dropped the larger bombshell in a book that was called The Descent of Man. In that one, he said, humanity is all one, and therefore we must strive toward a higher morality than that which we have developed so far. All people are equal and the same. You can see where an anti-slavery thinker would be going with this contention. And as I mentioned earlier, Darwin had already said the highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. We ought to control our thoughts. Now, Darwin was a naturalist, after all. He observed the facts on the ground, as we say nowadays. He heard the cries of that slave being beaten in the reading that I read earlier. He knew that slavery persisted in the United States and many other parts of the world. And the conclusion was plain. Religion is not sufficient to make individuals or governments behave in moral or ethical ways. I believe that's the idea that Darwin eventually came to. Darwin knew that despite the pretensions, Christianity and all the other human religions more often underwrite and condone the prejudices of the societies from which they come, right? They reinforce why I would do something as a prejudice, right? Rather than pointing toward a higher morality or a good and just society. I'm not an extremist concerning the effects of religion because, frankly, I think people will be people no matter what the religious or the political ideas of their time. On an individual level, that is, people are people. The evidence is all around us, after all. The vast majority of human beings are basically good, meaning most of us don't hurt other people most of the time. We don't steal or cheat or lie all that often. And most of the time, we human beings, from whatever culture, kind of go along to get along. And that indicates that it doesn't maybe come from particular religions, this attribute of human beings. Now, most of us don't act like a Jesus or a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King, but we don't act like a Stalin or a John Wayne Gacy either. Most people, whether they be Christian or Muslim or agnostic or atheist, go along to get along because that's the way human beings have evolved over time. As a matter of fact, the religions that we practice today are all less than 7,000 years old. And of course, the human mind is much, much older on the evolutionary time scale. Now, that's on an individual level that most people go along to get along. Where religions and political systems get dangerous, in my opinion, is in the aggregate. When those systems begin to say who can enslave whom, who can subjugate whom, and who can kill whom for what set of reasons. That's when religions begin to get dangerous. Consider again what Darwin said about slavery and the treatment of slaves. He said, all these deeds are done and palliated by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves, who believe in God and pray that His will be done on earth. It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty. That's a cry of moral outrage from Charles Darwin. And he saw that it is the aggregate of people that creates the evil by palliating, by underwriting and condoning and explaining away deeds of evil such as slavery. But in the face of this fact, Darwin saw, as perhaps no other human being had ever seen, as he thought about his theory that adaptations are adaptations, brain cells are brain cells. In humans, in primates, in animals, brain cells are brain cells. Muscle cells are muscle cells. We are all netted together, as Darwin put it. And William Shakespeare, the great playwright, said long ago, a touch of nature makes the whole world ken. But it took Charles Darwin to tell us just how true this is. And we still, I think, don't comprehend it. We are still on the frontier of this way of thinking that we are all netted together, all of humanity and all living things. Well, you say, but wait a minute, humans are unique, right? Well, we are, but what makes us unique is our consciousness. And not just our consciousness, but how we are able to use our consciousness. It's the sort of consciousness that allows us to think about the thoughts of others, other people, other animals. Now, this is the most complex form of consciousness, and research is very difficult in getting at how this differentiates itself. It's difficult for researchers to figure it out because there's basically two ways to act in the world. One is monitoring behavior, think of a cat watching a mouse. The cat isn't thinking about what the mouse is thinking. The cat is thinking about what the mouse is going to do next so that the cat can keep up with the mouse and it hopes to catch it, right? That's monitoring behavior, and that's the behavior which predators can do with prey, right? Now, there is another form of consciousness, and that is thinking what the other animal or person is thinking. And scientists call this theory of mind, having a theory of mind. I can think about what you are thinking or feeling. Now, the first one, the monitoring behavior, is all about me, isn't it? I'm in my head. But the second one includes you. Theory of mind is the key, then, to moral thinking. For example, think if I have two people, one on each side of the room, and I ask the person on the right what the person on the left can see. Now, the average human being will be able to think a little bit, look at the angles, and see where the person on the other side of the room is looking, and describe fairly in detail what that person can see. Because the person on the right can remove him or herself from just being on the right and think about what it would feel like and be like to be on the left side of the room. Cats can't do that because they don't have a theory of mind. Well, that's the way we can get at moral thinking, isn't it? We can think about what it feels like to be a slave, and we can figure out that we don't want that. We can think about what it feels like to be tortured. We don't want that for ourselves. We can think what it means to be poor or homeless. We don't want that for ourselves. And therefore, Darwin would argue, that makes us have a moral conscience that pushes us toward doing something about those things that we feel should not be. Now, excluding certain sorts of mental challenges, most people, most human beings over the age of 3 can imagine themselves in the locations of other people, whether that be on the other side of the room or on the other side of the economic divide. And of course, this is what opens our minds to empathy and compassion. Perhaps this empathy does not make us, as I mentioned earlier, a Jesus or a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King, but we're able to do it. And we can act with empathy and compassion and care. Now, the philosopher John Searle would say, quote, "Ontological subjectivity does not preclude epistemic objectivity," which he means by that, I can feel your pain. I can feel your pain. The average 4-year-old human has a theory of mind and can postulate what other animals and other people are thinking. On the other hand, the oldest and the wisest cat out there can never, ever do that. From Darwin's perspective, the ability to do that makes us special only insofar as it implies an obligation to act according to that knowledge. We know what it would feel like to be a slave, so Darwin would say we have an obligation to be sure slavery does not exist. We can feel what it would be like to be homeless, therefore we have an obligation to eradicate homelessness. Our level of consciousness implies an obligation. Before Darwin, the answer to the question of human morality was, poof, it's magic, some kind of a divine spark. Many people still see it that way. After Darwin, the answer is not so neat and tidy, but I think that the answer is far more interesting when we look at it from this perspective. So, when you encounter those who want to know why you don't rob a bank or kill somebody because you're an atheist or an agnostic or a free thinker or a humanist, I know that you will tamp down and quash that feeling of, oh, I just want to murder that person. Not because you're afraid of hell, and not because you're afraid of going to the electric chair or hanged or put in prison, but because actually you know what the person really means when they say that. Actually, they are asking one of the most fundamental of questions: how do we have morality in the first place? It seems like a miracle living in this world where most of the animals don't have it. Why are we usually good is what people are actually asking. And the corollary of that, why are we sometimes really, really bad? Darwin, remember, put it this way: the highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. Darwin saw the limitations of religion based on social norms. And Darwin saw a higher moral order than most Christians did back in his day in the 19th century. And that's the same claim that I would make about a Martin Luther King when he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail condemning those tepid Christians who were saying, "Hang on, wait, the South will change eventually. Why are you out there marching?" Right? Martin Luther King knew that he had to change the moral thinking among Christians, right? King knew that a Christianity that allowed for racial segregation was an immoral thing. And Darwin knew that a Christianity that allowed slavery was an immoral thing. King decided to stick with Christianity and stay in it to raise the consciousness of Christians, and Darwin chose the other side of that, to reject Christianity. Religions reproduce, for good and ill, the cultures in which they are embedded. This is what Darwin was beginning to realize. We all agree or disagree on a new idea, a new moral way of thinking, according to where we were born and what religion we are and all of these things, right? But Darwin asked the obvious question: if this is true, how do we ever decide that something is wrong? How can we decide slavery is wrong when the Bible says it's just fine? How do we realize that capital punishment is wrong, or torture, or even bullying? How can we decide those things are bad things? And of course, that's why we need a Darwin or a Martin Luther King. This is the profundity of the theory of natural selection. Far from making us mere animals, natural selection calls us to see beyond our limitations in time and place. Natural selection tells us to control our basic impulses, not because those are animal impulses, because you know what? All of our impulses are animal impulses. It tells us to control our thoughts because we are a particular kind of animal, and we can see beyond ourselves. That's the morality behind Darwin's famous theory of natural selection. And it goes a long way toward explaining where human morality and ethics come from. Thanks for listening today. My name is David Breeden. I am the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. We'd love to see you. Come by and visit sometime.